when I was first contacted to do this by Fiona Mackay. Fiona said, Alan, Lord Lyon would like to invite you to give a lecture for the Lord Lyon Society. And I thought, wow, my heraldic expertise and experience has been recognised. She immediately said, we don't want anything heraldic. Really, because it's Valentine's Day, we want something about love. And then I thought, my experience in the field of love has been recognised. And then she immediately says, but it's really about Robert Burns. So 1 out of 3 isn't too bad, I suppose. Now, let's see how to share here. Let's see if I can share. Now, what has come up there? Let me stop sharing that and try that again. Bear with me, folks. I had a wee bit of problem with this earlier. Right. Now, if you can see that, can someone come on and say, yes, we can see star-crossed lovers?
No, we can't, Alan.
No.
Remember from earlier, if you click the share box at the top, and then on the right-hand side, it will say windows, and then you click on the windows that are open in your box, just almost on the right-hand side.
Can we see
There
that?
we go.
There we go. Fantastic.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to come and speak this evening. I decided that I would speak about Robert Burns and the Highland Mary myth. The poet Robert Burns, of course, probably needs no introduction to all of you here, but he is undoubtedly one of the most iconic figures in Scotland's history, perhaps the most iconic. And within his lifetime, his works became famous in his homeland during the Scottish Enlightenment, and his collections of traditional Scottish songs for James Johnson and George Thompson, became akin to a national library of cultural memory. After Burns' death, his fame spread, and this coincided with the Scottish Enlightenment notion of forming clubs and society to stimulate conversation and debate. As the 19th century progressed, and assisted by the emigration of Scots throughout the British Empire, Burns's fame became truly global. So consequently, he is one of the most memorialized figures in history. Robert Burns himself is obviously very famous. And he's famous because of this memorialization of which I have just spoken. Memorialization is statues, it's clubs, it's editions of poetry, and it's also objects. And in fact, what's the topic of this particular lecture is the fact that Robert Burns and one of his great loves have become so memorialized. Now, despite the fact that I was told that it didn't have to be heraldic, there you can see on your screen one of, I think, the things I'm most proud, because if you have a wee look there, you'll see my name in that somewhere. When I became junior vice president of the Robert Burns World Federation, virtually the first thing I did was to persuade the board to approach the Lord Lyon to grant a coat of arms for Robert Burns, the coat of arms which Burns himself had spoken of in the 1790s. So there we go. We start off actually with a bit of heraldry. That is the achievement of Robert Burns, poet. So, um, who was this Highland Mary to Robert Burns? Um, we didn't really know anything about Highland Mary, or no one really knew anything about Highland Mary apart from Burns and his friends and family, until Burns started to write poems about her after her death. And you'll see there the names of some of his most famous Highland Mary poems: Highland Lassie O, Highland Mary, or you go to the Indies, my Mary, and to Mary in Heaven. But the last one you'll see, Ye Banks and Braes, I've put a little question mark after that because people nowadays are not sure that this is about Highland Mary, although his brother specifically said, his brother Gilbert specifically said that Highland Mary was the theme of that particular song. So who was she? Well, she was born in Dunoon in March 1763. But she's of particular interest to me and to anyone else in the Greenock Burns Club because she died in Greenock in October 1786. And in fact, where I'm sitting right now is about, believe it or not, about 400 yards from her grave, which is straight across that way at the top of the hill of Greenock Cemetery. That's not where she was originally buried, but it's where she was moved to, and there'll be a little bit more of that later. The poetry about Highland Mary from Burns, George Thomson, who produced a number of traditional Scottish songs in his edition and asked Burns to be the person to collect them. George Thomson said to him that he had just received his Highland Mary, his latest Highland Mary poem, and he said, "Your verses upon Highland Mary are just come to hand. They breathe the genuine spirit of poetry, and like the music, will last forever. I have heard the sad story of your Mary. You always seem inspired when you write of her." And in a letter to Francis Dunlop, dated the 8th of November 1789, Burns included the aforementioned Thou Lingering Star and stated, "I shall send you a song I made the other day, of which I seek your opinion, as I am too much interested in the subject of it to be a critic in the composition." So that date is quite significant, the 8th of November 1789, because he says that the song was written the other day, and it can be placed around the 3rd anniversary of the unexpected death of Mary Campbell. Also significant is the fact that Burns said he's too much interested in the subject to be objective about its quality. And in that song, it describes a parting. And that parting has become the way that we now imagine that Burns and Mary parted. But there's often in all of these things a lot of romance, and there's a lot of things taken for granted and a lot of artistic license. When Burns was talking about the afterlife in another letter, he said, "There should I, with speechless agony of rapture, again recognize my lost, my ever dear Mary, whose bosom was fraught with truth, honor, constancy, and love." So these letters that Burns was writing 3 years after Mary's death show that he was still deeply affected by her. Mary is undoubtedly the greatest and the closest link with Robert Burns which Greenock has. But he himself, despite these poems, actually wrote remarkably little. And it's almost as if he made a conscious decision not to write about Mary apart from in poetry. And the air of mystery may have contributed to a sort of religious or religiosity about Mary's devotion. Because he didn't write too much about Mary, we are indebted to his biographers, especially a chap called Robert Cromick. He first published Burns' notes on the subject, and he's the person who gave us the first definite proof that Highland Mary and Mary Campbell were one and the same person. And so who you see there is Mary Campbell, who is buried just a few hundred yards from here. The proof of this had been lost for years. And in fact, Cromick, as I said to you about the song where Burns talks about the parting, Cromick in his biography, and again a very sort of romantic Victorian view, said the lovers stood on each side of a small purling brook. They laid their hands in its limpid stream, and holding a Bible between them, pronounced their vows to be faithful to each other. They parted, never to meet again. Now, interestingly, that is, the Victorians loved that sort of thing. They really went for that in a big way. And in fact, they went for Highland Mary in a big way. But it was a particular shame about Cromick because he took his version of the Burns and Highland Mary story from something which was called um, the interleaved blank pages of another song compendium. So Burns had stuck pages in between and he was making notes for himself about the particular pages of the book. Cromick had that, and that's what he wrote this whole Highland Mary thing about. But Cromick was labelled a fraud when it was discovered that certain pages of that particular interleaved book were missing. And in fact, people should really have believed him because the family had read his biography before it was published, especially his brother, Burns's brother Gilbert. And they had specifically agreed, certainly tacitly agreed, that what was written in Cromick's work was a faithful reproduction of Burns's biography. Cromick was partially exonerated in 1921 when some of those missing pages, missing interleaves, were actually found in University of Edinburgh Library and they were published. And then in 2009, the particular note about Robert Burns' Highland Mary in Greenock was discovered in the Burns Birthplace Museum in Alloway. It had been there for years and had been miscatalogued. So in fact, it turns out now that everything that Cromick said was absolutely true, but 120 years ago, the poor man was being labelled a fraud. What Burns actually said about Highland Mary and Greenock is this. At the close of autumn in 1786, Mary crossed the sea to meet me at Greenock, where she had scarce landed when she was seized with a malignant fever, which hurried my dear, dear girl to the grave in a few days before I could hear of her illness. So actually, Mary, as I said there, was born in Dunoon. So why was she in Greenock? Well, she came, as Burns said, to meet him there before he went off to the West Indies, which of course he didn't in the end do. But also her brother Robert, her younger brother Robert, had just been given a job as a carpenter in Scotch shipbuilders. And Mary went with Robert to Greenock because she was going to meet Burns. But they had what was called a brothering feast the night before Robert started his apprenticeship as a carpenter. The next morning, when Robert was due to get up for work, he was very unwell. And it wasn't a hangover. It became very clear that it wasn't a hangover. In fact, he had a fever, and Mary looked after him during his fever. It was most probably typhus that he had. He recovered from it. Unfortunately, she caught it from him, and as it says here, alas, her devotion cost her her life. She also took the fever and she died. And she was She was buried at the extreme west of the old West Kirk in Greenock at the time. That's the traditional view of Burns and Mary parting. And you'll see that they are sharing in their hands, they're holding a book together. That is a Bible. Burns gave Highland Mary a Bible, or they exchanged volumes, 2 volumes, Old Testament and New Testament. And that was a sign in traditional Scottish custom of marriage to do this over a limpid stream, as Cromek says it, but they did this over the Ayr, the River Ayr. So it was taken as a sign of marriage, and of course, they then planned to meet again in Greenock. Now, after she died, and quite a number of decades after she died, in 1842, Greenock Burns Club erected this monument with great pomp and celebration. In fact, it was a highlight of the first half century of the club's history. This constituted one of the Burns cult's most significant acts of memorialisation. And when I say the word cult, cult in this sense simply means a movement. I could say the Burns movement, but I've been so used to calling it the Burns cult that that's what I'm referring to here. But there was a real cult which developed for Highland Mary, which came from the erection of this monument. There were donations from this, not just from Greenock, but from much further afield, all the way down to Liverpool and to London. And in fact, the Campbell Society of Glasgow, they gave 1 guinea, the princely sum of 1 guinea, which I suppose in 1841 was a significant donation. That monument cost £100. It's a sandstone monument carved by John Mossman, the Glasgow sculptor. So for 50, 60 years, there'd been nothing at the grave to mark it. And then that was laid. It was great pomp and ceremony, which was the norm actually for a Burns-themed thing at the time. There was a large civic involvement, attended by at least 10,000 people. Now, at the time, the population of Greenock was 15,000. So for 10,000 people to turn out to see the foundation stone of a monument being laid showed that either there was not much to do in Greenock at the time for enjoyment, or what it really does show is that Robert Burns, and by association, Mary Campbell, had become big, big news in Scotland, and indeed with donations coming from Firth of Greenock, well outside Scotland also. The parade that day consisted of the band of the 10th Regiment, the town officers, the Superintendent of Police, Robert Wallace of Kelly, MP, various lodges of foresters and oddfellows, and 15 visiting Masonic lodges who accompanied Lodge Greenock St John's and the Provincial Grand Lodge of Renfrewshire West. All of the monuments, all of the statues, all of the stone, foundation stone layings, which happened in the 19th century to do with Robert Burns, and indeed to do with Wallace and Bruce and all of Scotland's great heroes, were virtually always patriotic parades which were led by Freemasons. When the parade reached the kirkyard, the provincial grand chaplain offered a beautiful and appropriate prayer before the foundation stone was laid, and under the stone was placed a time capsule containing coins, newspapers, and an inscription stating that the monument had been erected by the contributions of many admirers of Scotia's bard in memory of his early love, Mary Campbell. Now, in the parade that day, there was a chap called Robert Weir Sr. Robert Weir was the treasurer of the Monument Committee. Robert Weir's son lived in Canada, in Ontario, and he was also Robert Weir Jr. The Bibles had gone to Canada when the nephew of Highland Mary who had been left these Bibles by her sister. He had moved to Canada, he'd run into financial difficulties, and he offered the Bibles for sale. And patriotic Scots in Montreal actually got together and they bought the Bibles back from him. And immediately they returned them to Scotland. That was their patriotic duty to ensure that the Bibles came back to Scotland. In fact, the Bibles were in Greenock for a short time and then went to Ayr. And in fact, they're in the Burns Monument at Alloway and have been for quite some time. But all of this happened roughly at the same time, the monument and the return of the Bibles. So they really sparked a movement for Highland Mary. Now, that movement for Highland Mary was known as Mariolatry. Now, Mariolatry is actually a fascination and a veneration for the figure of the Virgin Mary. In fact, Mariolatry is a bit of an insult, really. It means kind of over veneration, hysterical veneration. People who do venerate the Virgin Mary would be more likely to call it Mariology. But Mariolatry was a name which was given to Highland Mary. And if you look at the Virgin Mary and Highland Mary, there you can see her holding the Bibles, you can see that there is a similar, there's something going on which is linking, subconsciously linking Highland Mary with the Virgin Mary. And in a sense, and you're going to think this is over the top, but many academics have written this, in a sense, Robert Burns and Jesus. It's almost as if in Reformed Scotland, in Presbyterian Scotland, that for centuries before, Scotland had been a country who venerated the Virgin Mary. And it's almost as if not being able to do that because of the Reformation made Scots look elsewhere where they could actually apply that sort of thought. So Mariolatry, when we're talking about Robert Burns, was a name given to people who thought that there were far too many hysterical people almost applying religion and religiosity to Highland Mary, to the extent that there was a real cult which transformed around her. The Mariolaters said that she represented the poet's deepest and most enduring love, the woman with whom Burns would spend eternity in paradise. So, despite the lack of any real hard evidence, because what I've said to you so far is really all that exists about what Burns wrote about Mary Campbell, about Highland Mary, but without any real hard evidence apart from those words, we've suddenly agreed that Mary has a real importance to Burns, to the extent that statues, paintings, and many different material cultural objects produced throughout the 19th century, which exploited and expanded this tenuous legend with remarkable effect, and all manner of items were dedicated to her memory. Things like the locks of Mary's hair, the Bibles, large numbers of small-scale memorabilia, egg cups, which are perhaps a symbol of fertility and unhatched potential, postcards, paintings, Highland Mary napkin rings, statuettes of her, spode plates with her image on it. And in fact, this extended far beyond Scotland. She was extremely popular in England, and that statue was actually a statue commissioned by Queen Victoria, which she gave as a present to Prince Albert, because Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were obsessed with Burns and Highland Mary. And one of the things at the time, which was very popular in England, was to write songs about Highland Mary. And one of the ones goes like this. I have heard the mavis singing his love song to the morn. I have seen the dewdrop clinging to the rose just newly born. But a sweeter song has cheered me at the evening's gentle close. I have seen an eye still brighter than the dewdrop on the rose. 'Twas thy voice, my gentle Mary, and thine artless winning smile that has made this world an Eden. Bonny Mary, oh, Argyle. So that song that we all thought was a Scottish song was in fact an English song written by Mariolators in England. Now, this idea about Mariolatry was actually very common in Scotland at the time. There is, of course, another very famous Scottish Mary, and that is Mary Queen of Scots. Mary Queen of Scots, Burns was obsessed with her. Sir Walter Scott was also, and James Hogg, to the extent that at a time after the Catholic Emancipation Act, where Catholicism was gradually coming back into Scottish society, Mary Queen of Scots was almost given this religiosity. And in fact, there are relics of Mary Queen of Scots, which are of course prized very much nowadays. So it's not far-fetched to suggest that a Scotland who was kind of obsessed with religiosity and people called Mary would do so with Highland Mary. Now, perhaps the greatest Mariolater is this chap here. This is a chap called Colin Ray Brown. Colin Ray Brown was a Greenokian. He's perhaps the greatest memorializer of Robert Burns, and not just Robert Burns, in fact, great Scottish heroes. He's the man who raised the money in London for the statues which adorn the Scott Monument and Princes Street Gardens in Edinburgh. He's the man who was responsible for the Wallace Monument on the Abbey Craig in Stirling. He's the man who was responsible for the statue of Robert Burns on the Thames Embankment in London, the statue of Highland Mary in Dunoon, the Robert Burns World Federation, the Burns Chronicle, etc., etc. He's actually a great, great Scottish hero who is kind of unknown unless you're in the Burns world. But he actually said that seeing the foundation stone of the Highland Mary Monument being laid in Greenock, and these 10,000 people in this marvelous big parade, all these Masonic lodges, he was a member of one of the Masonic lodges in Greenock. He actually said that is what inspired me to become, in his words, a sincere disciple of Robert Burns. And once again, you can see what I mean by this religiosity. He actually says that everyone should worship Burns. And the interesting thing about Colin Ray Brown is that in his will, he specifically said he did not want any religious things in his will. And yet he had, at his funeral, he said this in his will. He didn't want that at his funeral. And yet he had Burns at his funeral, someone whom he said everyone should worship Burns, someone whom he said he was a disciple of. So this air of religiosity being put onto these great historical Scottish figures was actually quite a thing in the time. There's an academic called Karen Wilson Costa, and she says that the theme of loss is a necessary component of national nostalgia, which underpins many of Burns's songs. And she specifically mentions the Highland Mary songs, stating that they are favourite songs which obsessed Victorian Burnsians from near and far as they travelled to gaze on the landscapes evoked in these songs. Now, Highland Mary's grave actually became a place of pilgrimage. People came from far and wide and from all over the world to stand at Highland Mary's grave. And Greenock, believe it or not, became a centre of literary tourism. Literary tourism was a big, big thing during the Victorian era. People would travel to the Lake District to view Wordsworth's house. They would go to Edinburgh. They'd go to Abbotsford to see Scott's Place. They would go and see the Scott Monument. They went to Stratford upon Avon to see Shakespeare's house. People, it was a big, big thing. One of the most famous people actually who came to Greenock to see Highland Mary's monument was the widow of Abraham Lincoln, Mary Todd Lincoln. She was one of a number of foreign visitors who heaved a sigh over poor Highland Mary's grave during this period. That was her own words. So the reverence and the desire to embalm Mary's place in the Burns story increased throughout the century, to the extent that by its end, Highland Mary was being virtually canonized by people like the Greenockian author Archibald Munro, who said that the lustre of Mary's name, like that of other stars, whether fixed or planetary, borrows its fascination from a luminary brighter and greater than itself. The very obscurity of her origins and early condition set off by contrast the halo that now encircles her memory. And this allusion to a haloed Highland Mary as a bright star is echoed in this poem, which was written by Greenock Burns Club president Charles L. Brodie in 1920. Come, Mary, with approving smile, from radiant realms divine, light thou this consecrated grove, where rests thy second shrine. You can really see the Virgin Mary, Highland Mary comparison. They really did go in for this in a big way. And this is why Highland Mary is so famous in the Burns world now. Not because really of what Burns wrote, but of how the Victorians virtually canonized her. So, as I said, Colin Ray Brown, he saw Highland Mary in virtually the same way. But the interesting thing about Highland Mary, and you heard me say that the provincial grand chaplain gave a beautiful prayer when they laid the foundation stone. The interesting thing is that Highland Mary was not Robert Burns' wife. Jean Armour was Robert Burns' wife, and Mary's young and saintly image was contrasted with that of Jean Armour, who has always appeared as a sort of frumpy wife who had deserted Burns at his most desperate. So there was a real sort of Highland Mary versus Jean Armour thing going on, with most people, sadly for Jean, siding with the idea that Highland Mary was actually Burns's true and real love. And in fact, Jean was always portrayed like that, whereas Mary is this young, beautiful, saintly virgin. So poor Jean Armour got the rough end of the stick. There, of course, is probably the most famous view of Highland Mary. This is the monument at Dunoon, which you'll see if you go across from Gourock on the ferry. There you see Highland Mary. If you look in her left hand, you might just make out that she is holding the Bible given to her by Burns. And in fact, the position at Dunoon has her gazing across the Firth of Clyde roughly to Ayr, to Burns's birthplace. So at her birth, she's at her birthplace and she's looking across to Burns's birthplace. So there you see an order of service, a reinterment of the remains of Burns's Highland Mary. So an early 20th century discovery in Greenock led to speculation on the reason for Burns's continuing strong feelings regarding Mary years after her death. By World War I, Greenock had become one of the most important shipbuilding centres in the British Empire. But the conflict caused a pressing necessity for the increase of merchant shipping and consequently for the rapid construction of ships to cater for the war effort and for Britain's ever increasing trade. Consequently, local shipbuilding companies sought expansion to cope with larger vessels. As they did, their associated engineering firms and themselves were looking to buy up land on Greenock waterfront. Now, Highland Mary was buried at the Old West Kirk. The Old West Kirk, for any of you who know Greenock, was roughly where the new ocean terminus is right now, right next to Tesco's car park. If you want the exact details of it, that's where the Old West Kirk was. But Caird and Company were taken over by Harland and Wolff, and Harland and Wolff decided that they wanted that land to expand the shipyard, which was right next to it. So within months of them taking over, an article had appeared in the Glasgow Herald detailing a planned extension and the removal of the neighbouring Old West Kirk. Now, the Old West Kirk was the first purpose-built Protestant church in Scotland. It was built right at the Reformation, the first church to be built after the Reformation. So, in fact, it was the first church to be built for the Protestant religion. So, a very historical building. But actually, even more historical was the fact, for Greenockians anyway, and for Burnsians, that Highland Mary was buried there. So the Greenock Burns Club members and the Burns Federation members were very, very opposed. And in fact, they urged all their members to lobby Parliament. And in fact, this was brought up in Parliament about how it was unpatriotic to have done this. This is a minute from the Burns Federation saying that as patriotic Burnsians and Scotsmen, the Federation tenders its heartiest thanks to Mr. Scott, Morrison, Rowan, and Macara and other members of the Greenock Burns Club for their noble and patriotic opposition to the proposal to sell and remove the ancient West Church and churchyard, and so to prevent an indelible disgrace being inflicted upon the name and fame of Scotland. Now, of course, they're trying to build or extend the shipyard because of patriotism, because they want bigger ships for Britain, for its trade and to protect itself. But that shows you how important this was to Scots at the time, that Highland Mary's grave was not going to be disturbed. After months of wrangling, finally the shipyard got its way. And in fact, paid for by Harland and Wolff, the church was dismantled stone by stone. The graves were all exhumed. The church was rebuilt about 500 yards further west, and Highland Mary was reinterred. And she was reinterred in the new cemetery, which is the place that is just a few hundred yards from where I'm sitting just now. However, on the 8th of November 1920, 14 men, including representatives of Greenock Burns Club and the Burns Federation, attended this exhumation. And what they discovered became the source of later controversy. Highland Mary was about to become once again the biggest national and international talking point in the Burns Club, in the Burns world. But in the meantime, on the 13th of November 1920, Mary Campbell's remains were reinterred with all the trappings of woe, and the ceremony was attended by large numbers of the public. And here, actually, you'll see no sound, But this is Mary's coffin. Look at all those, well, they're not working class gentlemen in their top hats, but there were thousands of people who turned up to see Highland Mary being reinterred in the spot where she is now. Um, the oak coffin was purchased by Greenock Burns Club. It bears the inscription Mary Campbell, Highland Mary, and was surmounted by 3 wreaths, one bound with Campbell tartan ribbon. It was lowered into the laurel-lined grave by the pallbearers, who included the President and Secretary of the Burns Federation and the President and Secretary of Greenock Burns Club. The Reverend W.J. Nicholl Service, who performed the ceremony, prayed that Burns and Mary had been reunited in the fellowship of soul with soul, in that place where love is perfect and immortal. No mention of Burns's wife, Jean Armour, was recorded. A choir sang, and a benediction was delivered. Then the grave was filled with earth from the Old West Kirk. Clearly, even in 1920, the Mariolatry in Greenock Burns Club and the Burns cult was still strong. So, what was it that was discovered in Highland Mary's grave which became such a cause of controversy? Well, in the northwest corner, sodden with water, was found the bottom board of an infant's coffin. Now, the story of this child's coffin board lay unnoticed for a decade until this woman, Catherine Carswell, in her biography, The Life of Robert Burns, made a statement to the effect that Mary Campbell had died after she gave birth to a premature infant, offering no sound evidence other than the coffin board. Of course, since Mary had been Burns's lover before her death, Carswell reasoned that the poet was the father. Now, this controversial book, more than any other, caused claim and counterclaim, and the hypothesis about Mary's condition was the most incendiary. This outraged the Mariolators in the Greenock Burns Club and the Burns Federation, and the backlash saw Carswell receive a bullet in the mail from someone using the nom de plume Holy Willie. Ian McIntyre, who's a writer on Burns, states that upon its serialisation in the Daily Record, all hell broke loose. And he quoted the Glasgow MP John S. Clarke, who stated that Carswell's book was employed in the resurrection of the ghoulish remains of great men. Carswell's biographer, Jan Pildich, states that Carswell was experiencing financial difficulties at the time, and that because no publicity is bad publicity, she relished the idea of the controversy, being confident in her own capacity to defend herself. In a paper presented to Greenock Burns Club, Dr. Mary Seenan discussed the vehement outrage caused by the book and said, when this biography was first published in 1930, many Burns enthusiasts denounced it as a prurient collection of lies written with the sole purpose of making money by focusing on the poet's sexual appetites and attacking the reputation of Mary Campbell. So, as recently as 1988, writers such as Richard Fowler have argued that Mary's death from a malignant fever signified that she was by then well advanced in pregnancy, particularly if that fever was the typhus rampant at the time in Greenock. The Burns Chronicle refused to review this book, but it readily published an article by the Reverend Dr. Lachlan MacLean Watt, who was Carswell's most vociferous antagonist, and Watt stated that this book is an offence. It's an offence to good feeling. It's an offence to the spirit of justice. It's not a biography. It is not far off from being the kind of record Satan might keep at the door of his dark abode, lest a repentant sinner might slip into higher places of peace after struggle, failure, and victory. A book he might bring forward to prove a poor soul's previous convictions in some final court of spiritual common pleas. As a biographer, it is without real value. You can see that even in 1930, the Mariolators were determined that they were going to preserve Mary Campbell's name and reputation. So Carswell's book may have been an enormous talking point in the Burns cult at the time, but her attempts at conversion with regards to Highland Mary would take many years to gain any real traction within the Burns cult, and in truth, it would never really gain traction in Greenock Burns Club, where her grave and monument are reverently cared for to this day. The saintly Mary thus preserved her halo, carefully manufactured by Greenock's Mariolators from the late 19th century for decades to come. And indeed, the importance of Highland Mary to the Greenock Burns Club shows no signs of abating. Only last year, this happened. This is the achievement of Greenock Burns Club. This was applied, it was petitioned for last year, and Lyon was gracious enough to grant it to the club, and in fact came to the club to present it. If you remember the coat of arms of Robert Burns at the start, you will see how that relates very strongly to Burns. It has the shepherd's crook and the shepherd's pipe in saltire in chief. And whereas Burns has a holly bush, Greenock Burns Club has a green oak tree. And then, of course, you'll see the undie below it, which represents the fact that we are indeed on the sea. But the most important thing in terms of this particular lecture is if you look at the crest that was chosen, you will see that the crest is indeed the monument to Highland Mary. Now, I don't need to tell anyone here that a coat of arms is in fact a pictorial representation of a person or indeed a corporation. And so it is fitting for Greenock Burns Club to have on its pictorial representation of exactly what it is, to have the Highland Mary monument as its crest. So to finish, since the start of the 19th century, an elaborate myth has developed, and Highland Mary remains the most famous of all women associated with Burns. Academics believe that due to this myth, she has assumed a far greater importance in the Burns story than perhaps she is entitled to, as in evidential terms, there is certainly not enough to merit the attention and status that she has acquired amongst many Burns devotees. However, despite this, and perhaps intentionally, thanks in no small part to the Mariolators of Greenock Burns Club, the myth has benefited Greenock. It has been of particular benefit to the club itself, the status of which in the Burns Club has been elevated by being uniquely identifiable as the club most intertwined with Highland Mary. In turn, the desire to preserve this status may account for the continued Highland Mariolatry at Greenock Burns Club, which regularly raises funds for the upkeep of her monument and which annually, on the second Sunday of May, holds a Highland Mary church service in the Lyon Kirk, which is the successor to the Old West Kirk. On a civic level, the myth also helped to fuse the town's Highland and Lowland population by providing a common denominator. Burns and Highland Mary appear to have symbolised the union of Highland and Lowland Scots. And you have to remember that in Greenock, we still had a Gaelic choir, and we still have a Gaelic school to this day, because Greenock has a huge number of people with Gaelic genes. The model rendered Burns' heroine both romantic and unfamiliar by exacerbating the Highland-Lowland culture divide romanticised in popular 19th century fiction, and particularly in Sir Walter Scott's Waverley, a divide that the legend of Burns and Highland Mary at once epitomised and reconciled. There can be little doubt that the relationship between Highland Mary and Greenock Burns Club has been mutually beneficial. Mary having given the club a unique focus which boosted its renown in the Burns cult, and the club opening the floodgates of the memorials which, in the absence of any real archival evidence, would compose her memory and establish a cult in her name, affecting how future generations would view both her and the poet, who would have been rectified through her salvific powers. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Alan. I'm sure everybody appreciated that. We could raise our hands in the usual fashion and just say thank you to Alan. I'm sure you all found that a fascinating talk, as I did, and whole aspects of it that we really had no idea that were going on. And I've learned some factual stuff from it now, from listening to it. But before we go any further, I'm going to stop. And if everybody would take their hands down now and put their hands up again if they would like to ask Alan a question. Any questions? Isabel. Where's Isabel's got her hand up?
I really didn't mean to have my hand up.
Right.
But well done. That was fascinating. Absolutely brilliant, Alan. Loved it.
Thank you.
So interesting.
Right. Fascinating you've got from Isabel. Anybody got a question? Elizabeth.
Alan, that was absolutely fascinating, and thank you so much, and good to see you. Do we actually know very much more about Mary Campbell? Because she's only 23 when she died. Do we have any more background to her?
So there are some academics who have done biographical research into her, but there is an awful lot of conflicting stories about her. There are so many things actually that we think we know, and then someone else has come up with another thing which almost contradicts it. We don't know exactly the date of her death. We don't know exactly where she died in Greenock, because her sister said she died somewhere differently from where her mother said she died. We don't really know what she did when she was in Greenock. She was apparently to go to Glasgow to work for a Colonel MacIver as a servant in his house. Burns wrote, "Will you gang to the West Indies with me, my Mary?" Was she going to the West Indies with Robert Burns, who was going to become working on a sugar plantation? Was she going with him? No, because it wasn't the done thing for young men to take unmarried women with them. But then again, she was a Campbell, and the Campbells were huge in sugar in Jamaica. So did the Campbells do something to make that happen? There are so many things which people come up with an answer, and then someone disproves the answer, or someone comes up with another theory to say, actually, that's a lot of nonsense, because that's not really what happened. We don't know what she died of. We suspect, because her brother had this terrible fever and typhus, there was an epidemic in Greenock at the time. We suspect that's what it was. We don't know if she died in childbirth, although some people would say that a young woman who got typhus at the time, if she was a fit young woman, would be fine, would get over it in the way her brother did. But in fact, if she was a pregnant young woman, she definitely would have died from it. So in answer to your question, Elizabeth, we know lots of theories. Will we ever know? I should suspect not. Interestingly, I mentioned a guy called Ian McIntyre previously. Ian McIntyre got the Scottish Daily Express to agree to pay for the exhumation of Mary. This is in 1991, so that we could now do the newfangled DNA tests, which of course they didn't have in 1920, to see whether or not there was anything left of this baby who had been buried there, and to see if it tied in with Mary's DNA, because we do have locks of her hair. Greenock Burns Club, who own the grave, declined. There you go. Those of you from Greenock Burns Club who are on here, did you know that you declined to have it? It was all going to be paid for by the Scottish Daily Express. But you know what? I think the Burns Club probably thought, she's been disturbed once, the poor girl, leave her alone. And I think probably the club was right.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
Lord Lyon, we have a question from Lorna, and the question is in the chat box is, would there ever be a case to allow a sample of DNA from her remains?
So we do. I mean, we've got locks of her hair, and we know that that is her. There are people who are still alive who are related to her. So we could have that DNA, but without actually going back into the grave. It's not really her DNA that's the thing. It's the DNA of this child. Because if that DNA of the child matches her, then that would be very, very interesting. Incidentally, I didn't say it in the talk because I felt it would have just extended it. But there was a jeweler in Greenock called Duncan Henry, who in 1920 said that his aunt had died as an infant, and because the family had moved from Campbellton and they knew the people who owned Highland Mary's, the plot where she was buried, he said that it was a family tradition that his aunt, who had died as an infant, had been buried in that grave. I've actually spoken to Duncan Henry's grandson, who lives over in Ardentiny, and he confirmed that yes, that is a family tradition, that his aunt was buried as an infant in Highland Mary's grave. But you know what? There are so many things about Robert Burns, because he was such a symbol of Scottish nationality at a time when Scots were moving all over the world. They took Burns with them because he represented Scotland to them, and so people they're desperate to be associated with Burns, especially in the 19th century. So if you believe all the stories, Robert Burns has been in every village in Scotland. If you believe all the stories, because everybody wants to say Burns was here, Burns was here. So anything that would attach people to Burns, even if it was to do with Highland Mary, yeah, absolutely, especially in the 19th century when this young girl was a goddess.
Yeah, who could have imagined that in fact reality television is not new? You just need to go into the history, and you've got all of this kind of complex relationships going on and theories going on. Any other questions? Comments?
Lord Lyon, there's another comment from Isabel. I don't know if everyone can see the chat. She was on the committee when the DNA was discussed, and the agreement was to leave her alone.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think I would be. I think that's probably a very good, solid, position to take.
What I would leave you with is the fact that Burns is such an icon for Scotland that, and this isn't an advert for the Robert Burns World Federation, but it kind of is, that, do you know what, we should all take a little bit of responsibility for making sure that Scottish culture is always to the fore, and especially when we're talking about our great national heroes like Robert Burns. So go along to your Burns suppers and enjoy them, because it makes us uniquely, or it's one of the things that makes us uniquely Scottish.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll wind up there because we've been very good at trying to keep to the hour that lets people get either on for a late supper or on to where they're going. Can I just say, reflecting on the comments, lots of lovely comments there, Alan, about excellent talk and also very interesting and engaging. And I'm sure that's everybody would appreciate the work that you've put into it. And it was something that we probably have learned a lot for. So I can ask you to put your hands together and just give him a clap. I don't know if he'll hear it or not. Alan, well done. And thank you very much again. Now, that's us finished around about 8 o'clock, which I think is a good time. And just to say to you that we're kind of moving on with